So as Graham mentioned, there's a substantial history to teaching as inquiry, and it didn't start when it ended up in our national curriculum. There's a long history of teacher research. Then people started naming what they were doing, teaching as inquiry or other alternative inquiry approaches, and began doing it really well. Processes were set up, systems were in place for doing it. But what I'm really interested in are those who are really moving to say, yes, we know how to do this, but we want to do it with a whole bunch more rigour to get a lot more out of these inquiries in terms of what it means for our students. So I'll just touch on these 6 ideas about rigour. There's a whole lot of others, but let's skip through these 6 for today. So the kind of data and which aspect of teaching as inquiry it's used for, I think, can really support rigour. I think people have tended to focus on and draw on data to help them with their focusing inquiry, looking at data to help them work out the priorities and what might be most important, and obviously for the assessment work that goes on as part of a learning inquiry. But I think people are much less inclined to use data in terms of that aspect of inquiry, the bit that sits between the teaching inquiry and the learning inquiry. The bit which says, actually, the teaching inquiry leads you to do some things, the teaching and learning happens. It's where the rubber's hitting the road. And I think when you're also including data about that aspect of teaching as inquiry, it can become much, much more rigorous. The touchstone for inquiry. So just having an inquiry process in place isn't sufficient. If we're really going to do something rigorous and have something that makes a difference for teachers and learners, then the touchstone for it needs to shift. And I'm suggesting these kinds of shifts from inquiry that's just descriptive, straight out describing what's happened for whom, what people have done and the sequence they've used and the activities they've used, through to something that's explanatory. It's kind of getting into that curiosity idea that Graham mentioned. So really helping you unpack some curiosities and come up with new ways of understanding why things are working and why they're not. Moving from the status quo to the new is another touchstone for rigorous inquiry. It's not good enough, even if you did 50 brilliant inquiries about the same old things that you've done for the last 20 years, we're not getting any additional rigour and not gaining anything from it. So good teaching as inquiry leads to new things, new practices, new ways of thinking, and new ways of doing things. And I think that's also helped by a move from the general, just an inquiry about my practice per se, or my teaching in this class, this term per se, through to quite particular foci for inquiries, focusing on very particular, carefully selected groups of students or aspects of learning, elements of the curriculum, and aspects of your practice. Really careful, particular, really purposefully chosen aspects of those things. When the touchstone moves to learning, that too suggests much more rigour and inquiry. Rather than just a procedural thing, I'm going to do the focusing inquiry, check, move on to the teaching inquiry, check, done the teaching, move on to the learning inquiry, check. If we get rid of that compliance, kind of going through the motions way of thinking about things, and we really have it driven by learning, that I want to learn something new, come up with a new understanding or a new skill or a new capability as part of doing this inquiry, then it's been worthwhile, it's been rigorous enough. So in colloquial terms, moving from a blah inquiry to one with a bit of bang, one with some punch and interest in it. Alison has touched beautifully on student voice, but I'm really interested in this idea too, and in some work with a team of teachers working on a teacher-led innovation fund project at Pakuranga College. They were interested in student voice informing inquiries at all phases of the inquiry, and in particular using a student response system to gather student voice. So they put in an application for a TLIF project focused on using the Go Soapbox student response system, and to really examine deeply how they might use that in innovative and interesting ways to learn new kinds of things and get to those touchstones I referred to on the previous slide. They really wanted teaching and learning to be framed as a partnership, for new things to be revealed, for real insights to come, surprises if you like. They were really setting the scene for surprises to emerge about how students were learning, what they were thinking, what was and wasn't working. And to get a diversity of viewpoints. The beauty of this student response system, like many others, is the option for anonymous responses, so that at the click of a button, in the space of a moment, the teacher could become aware not just of the most dominant and vocal students' perceptions of how things were for them, but from the whole class, including all of the members of that class and all of their diversities. And really they were interested in developing agency and relationships. Their underpinning theory was if we use these kinds of systems and lots of prominent approaches and very explicit invitations for students to share their voice, their feedback, their opinions and ideas, then it wasn't important just to learn from that, but what was important was the building of the trust in that class and school community, the kind of relational trust that's important for so many other outcomes. They set about doing this and wanted a quite systematic way of going about this. They didn't want just to ask any old question or any old invitation for student voice. They wanted a way of thinking about how to gather that student voice. So we talked a lot about the different modes, types of data, structure, foci and samples. This framework was the basis of a whole lot of ideas when a group of teachers shared all of their prior experience and suggestions for future practices in relation to these things. But they focused in on that technological mode in particular, the Go Soapbox student response system, and looked at different ways of gathering data using that system. This little template became quite a stimulus of ideas. So what this matrix does is take each of the inquiries across the top. I'm not sure if you can see a column for focusing, teaching, the experience and the learning inquiry. And we took some of the quite typical approaches from research methods about gathering, using questionnaires and using surveys, and tried to apply those to the kinds of questions that they would put in the student response system. Dichotomous questions, multiple choice, rank order, rating scales, semantic differentials, and so on and so forth. And this wasn't a task that they had to complete every cell, but it was just a prompt to say, you might get into some very kind of habitual ways of asking student voice. Even if you're very keen to do it and do it often, it's very easy to just ask the same old thing day in, day out, or have a repertoire of 4 or 5 things that you turn to because they're in your bank of strategies. So this just forced people to think, hey, there might be another different way that might reveal quite different and much more important insights if we get thoughtful about this. So for example, in the focusing inquiry, a dichotomous question might give students a list of topics and they indicate yes or no, whether they're interested in those. For instance, in the focusing inquiry strand of things, still a percentage allocation. Maybe there's 3 aspects of the teaching that are coming up and students can indicate a percentage allocation to each of those 3 aspects of the upcoming assessment. They want 20% allocated to aspect 1, 70% to aspect 2 and 10% to aspect 3. Quite clearly, did I do the maths right there? Quite clearly signalling where their needs are, and across a whole class's responses would give teachers a really good idea that actually it's aspect 2 that I need to allocate more time to. In terms of the teaching inquiry, maybe it's a rank order scaling. The teacher's got 3 or 4 ideas about the approach to use. They could be ranked by students, those which are the most preferred, most challenging, most interesting, or most something else that's relevant to that class. An unfinished sentence example, maybe in terms of a teaching inquiry, the thing I'm most confused about is. An invitation or a question-seeking invitation. The most typical kind of question people tended to use was just the straight old answering a question, but this one turns that on its head. What's the question you most wanted to ask but didn't? In terms of the actual experience of teaching and learning, perhaps a rating scale here. How helpful was a certain approach, or how confident was a student about an upcoming assessment, using an agreement scale or a confidence scale or some other relevant scale. Semantic differentials are fun. I love using these, and they can really kind of get nice distinctions between things. Perhaps a reflection on a unit and on a scale where at one end is the boring scale point and 6 points over to the other side, the interesting scale point, and students rate for those quite opposite reactions to a particular teaching approach or teaching focus or whatever it might be. a forced choice perhaps in terms of a learning inquiry. Which of these three things the teacher tried do you think were most helpful? Students can often tend to be quite positive leaning in their responses, so perhaps if there were 5 things listed and students can choose only 3 that were most helpful from the teacher, that forcing of the choice helps the teacher understand where the weaknesses might have been. The group of teachers at Pakuranga who worked with this and trialled that student response system were also asked, we did an inquiry of their inquiries, if you like. It was a bit nested in that way, and we found out that these kinds of approaches, when they were pushed to use new and different ways of gathering student voice, really did have an impact on them. Sometimes it confirmed their expectations, but very often it also revealed surprises, challenged assumptions, and alerted them to particular groups of students. So that's the percentage number of all the times that they used this, and we tracked them over a year, every week that they were trialling these things. So even a percentage of 54% of the time, if they're alerted a particular group of students, that's an impressive result. They were also interested in, as I mentioned, about the impact this had on relational trust across the whole body of students. So we also administered a trust survey to look at what impact was this having at that deeper level of things. And I can point you to the TLIF report where that's outlined. Research is another really important aspect of a rigorous inquiry and a bit of a hobby horse of mine. It's why I'm so delighted with the work of the Education Hub and Nina and others involved with this. The importance of rigour coming from research, the wisdom of those who've done and published studies and research on all aspects that might be relevant to a teacher's inquiry, alongside the expertise and wisdom of teachers and practitioners from their own experience. So it's really important, I think, that teachers are aware of where they often say, oh, I don't know where to get it, or it's too difficult to access research. And that may be the case, but it's getting less so thanks to sites like the Education Hub and these research guides and other parts of that material available. And similarly, places overseas too. In my inbox, I get these best evidence and brief updates and other similar ones from other institutions. This one provides beautiful little snippets just in a tiny short paragraph, a little taster of some research findings that I think are relevant to all sorts of practitioners. And in one email, you can quickly scan the findings of an interesting study about fostering curiosity, theatre versus film field trips, classes that loop, gifted kids learning and things like that. So they might be research, but they're utterly relevant to practice, and these kinds of updates give teachers an entry into those.
Free site too, it's a free site.
It is, yes, absolutely. Yep. Similarly, I don't think we pay enough attention to the hard work of our own teachers in schools who are doing masters and doctorates, publishing theses and articles from that work, and often they'll get shared, but very often, with the humble teachers who are doing this work, they don't get shared and read amongst their colleagues as much as they could and should. This is just one example from a doctoral student of Graham and mine, actually, and a teacher at Pakuranga College, Martin Davison, and this was one way that he analysed and framed up his findings. Jane, this will be familiar to you too, about developing students' historical empathy. And maybe teachers don't need to read the whole thesis, every single teacher in the country, but there's interesting snippets from every teacher practitioner's master's or doctoral work that has relevance to their colleagues. And these elements of historical empathy are really important for history teachers to be mindful of, and the way that Martin analysed those using spider diagrams to look at shifts before and after two different ways of approaching the teaching has been really helpful to other teachers. Also summaries of research. So for example, these International Bureau of Education summaries on all sorts of topics, effective pedagogy in all sorts of realms, are incredibly helpful because they take away the work from teachers of reading hundreds and hundreds of articles and give them access to a very readable and short synthesis of those studies. Graham and I wrote one of these around social studies and the social sciences, but there's a whole suite, some 30 odd, nearly 40 maybe of these in other areas too. Really readable and digestible for a group of teachers to work on together. I also go to the extreme of suggesting that teachers should be reading the articles about empirical studies too. Not hundreds of them and not every single day perhaps, but I think if you're a teacher of science, then finding a key science research journal that's relevant also to teaching and to practice would be a really important one to subscribe to, and 3 or 4 times a year get an email with an update of the research in a journal like that. Not all of them might be relevant, but I would put money on it that at least 1 or 2 of those articles would really resonate and be worth reading and talking with your colleagues about. The content alerts, kind of part of these academic journal websites, makes that really easy to subscribe to. And then you get really access to really fabulous articles like this one. I thought was really fantastic if I was a science teacher, which I'm not. But actually it's still relevant to me and relevant to my tertiary teaching. It's about what you do, what teachers do, and the impact of what they do in those little moments where students experience confusion, and how teachers handle confusion, what happens when students surface and don't surface that confusion, and how that plays out for everybody's learning as a result. Really relevant to science teachers because it's in the science context, but relevant to others too. And obviously that's one example from many millions that we could use. Collaboration is the next point about rigour in inquiry. As Graham mentioned, we didn't intend this to be, a sole event. We know that that in organisations the wisdom doesn't just flow down from the top in a beautiful, as the hierarchical organisation chart might suggest, but it's much messier, and the wisdom lies across the organisation and people with all sorts of roles. So when you have a really strong network, such as the one signalled by the top social network diagram there, that isn't just a pretty diagram of a group of people in a school organisation. That represents a flow of wisdom and expertise and knowledge and ideas and experience. When a network is strong, people are interacting and sharing all of those things. There's benefits for the teachers, and there's really strong empirical evidence that the kids in schools where the teachers' network looks like the top one do better than those kids in schools where the teachers' network looks like the bottom one. There's much less reciprocity to and fro, there's much less density in the number and position of exchanges, and there's a whole bunch of outliers who don't typically talk and share or get to receive from others. I've just, about a year or so ago, finished an evaluation of the Teacher-Led Innovation Fund, and as part of that I had the real privilege to case study 2 different groups of teachers, one in the North Island, one in the South, a primary and a secondary group of teachers. And what struck me about both of these very impressive, very rigorous collaborative inquiry groups was how different they were and how they structured themselves and how they did their inquiry. In the first group, there was a simultaneous inquiry. They were all focused on the same thing, trying the same things, investigating the same impacts about students' transition to school, their attendance, and their literacy achievement. It was very systematised. They all used the same observation templates, and there was a highly routined way about how they went through those observations. They had routines about going to early childhood centres and speaking with whānau and families, and so on and so forth. Part of that routine included not only visiting an early childhood centre in the morning, but a follow-up where a pair of teachers who'd been out visiting read a pre-allocated piece of research and talked about it together, and then came back and shared it with the group at a later meeting. Fabulous outcomes, fabulous group of teachers, and really impressive way of doing inquiry. In the South Island, with two secondary schools working together on a Teacher-Led Innovation Fund project, totally different approach. They were a group, but they were all doing their own individual inquiries that were relevant to them, but coming back and sharing those with one another, kind of in sequence. They'd meet a couple of times a term, and approximately two of them would present to all of the others, whoever it kind of made sense and it was the most relevant time in the inquiry to be sharing. And that meant that the others who were doing different inquiries were learning about the approach that those two presenters were taking, and everyone else's inquiries would improve as a result, even though they were on quite different things. I can share the link as part of this going up on the web if you want to read the report in more detail about those two cases. Finally, just the idea about problems in inquiry. So teaching as inquiry shouldn't be this kind of smooth ride and a beautiful sequence and a nice cycle, and you start at one place and come to the end and it was all lovely and straightforward. Actually, if it's going well, it should be surfacing a whole lot of problems. I call them problems, maybe Graham called them curiosities, it's a bit softer. But I think if you're doing it well, the problems are really emerging and you're getting the opportunity to grapple with them and therefore improve practice. So it should give rise to them. And what's really is important, especially when we think about inquiries happening in group contexts and people hearing other people's inquiries and the problems that are emerging, is that people have beliefs about what's going on and what's involved in those problems. And so rigour comes about when we really are able to test the validity of our beliefs in order to solve those problems. When we've looked at transcripts about how people talk with one another when they're talking about problems, we know that there's three kinds of beliefs involved. The belief about what the problem is, and that may or may not be shared amongst those discussing the problem. The beliefs about the explanation for it. What's caused this problem? What's been going on? Who's to blame? Or what might be related to the problematic practice or outcome for kids. And beliefs about the solution. Everyone's got, in fact, people have more of these than the other beliefs, ideas about what to do. We're inclined to be quick fixes, maybe it's the number 8 wire thing, but people are quick to come up in their own head at least with what someone ought to be doing or should do differently there. Once you've got those beliefs, and everyone has them, what's important is to test the validity of them, not assume their truth. But when we've looked at conversation transcripts to analyse how often do people do these kinds of validity testing behaviours, what's really clear is that people are getting better once they've been exposed to some learning about this at actually disclosing their key beliefs, putting it on the table. They're less inclined to provide the grounds for them, the really good reasoning about why they think that problem is occurring, what the problem is or what they should do about it. The grounds, the unpacking of the why, the reasoning is much less apparent typically. And people do very little of the exploring difference. Very often in a dyad of 2, and especially in a group of 6 or 8 or 10 teachers, the beliefs about what's going on with the problem will be different. And people very rarely explore that difference. Often they'll realise it's there, they'll recognise that there's a different point of view, but very rarely will they actually engage with that difference, name it and explore it and understand it and resolve it. And therefore they can't examine the logic or really do well in terms of seeking agreement about what the problem is, what causes it and what to do. In fact, that pattern is quite different for different types of beliefs, and what's especially troublesome is that problem explanation beliefs are the beliefs that are most likely, 90% of the time, to not have those kinds of validity testing behaviours used for them. So if we're not understanding cause, then we're not going to logically solve them, and our inquiries won't really move us along and we won't generate good solutions to improve practice. So more rigorous inquiry will address those kinds of things too. In fact, the several hundred teachers who responded to the TLIF questionnaire, when they rated the rigorousness of their discussions in their collaborative inquiry group, the higher their rating of the rigour in their discussions, the higher the rating of the impact of them in terms of their dispositions, their own knowledge, skills, their students and their practice shifts. So when conversation rigour about inquiry and problems are high, we get what we intended to get in terms of those kinds of impacts.